Here's the second tiebreak game in the World Championship match between world champion Magnus Carlsen and challenger Fabiano Caruana. Carlsen won the first tiebreak game, so Caruana very keen to hit back in the second, and he's taken on Carlsen's Sicilian Sveshnikov again. So both players came to this game very well prepared, as they played this a few times in the match previously. So Caruana repeating the knight d5 variation, and after the exchange, if you remember, knight b8 played by Carlsen in the first games, but this time he went back to knight e7 that he played in game 12 quite successfully. So Caruana obviously ready for this, and they repeated this line. So all as in game 12, and now instead of bishop f5 as in that game, Carlsen decided to defend the d-pawn using the queen. This doesn't look bad at all. h4 flicked in by Caruana. Now we don't want as black to allow this, so h5. It's still not clear to me who benefits from the advance of this h-pawn actually. As we'll see, there can be a slight problem for white, but sometimes this pawn on h5 can also be vulnerable. Interesting. Bishop e3 played. This all looks pretty normal. And very quickly played by Carlsen, deciding to push white's queen back and using that a-pawn. And, well, there are pros and cons to advancing this pawn. Slightly weakens the b5 square. You might gain some space and be able to later bring the rook into play, but that pawn could also be vulnerable. It's a really double-edged position. I mean, just in general, it's very unbalanced just because of the different pawn structures. So we have black with this 4-3 pawn majority on the king side, and white with the 4-3 pawn majority on the queen side, and both sides will try to advance. So it's like these shifting tectonic plates in the position, which creates a very dynamic situation. Queen c8 from Carlsen. Now the point of that is that after bishop e2 hitting the pawn, then bishop g4 prevents that. And here I have a feeling that if this were a classical game, then Caruana would have sat and thought for a long time and worked out some very nice idea. The obvious way to continue is to take here. And if pawn takes, I think queen e2, now we have such an unclear situation where, well, white's king might be actually quite safe here. Whereas black's king, I'm not sure where black's king goes, actually. And there's a chance for white to open up the king side with h5. So maybe best his queen takes. Now, I can only assume that Caruana thought that this endgame was a bit unclear, considering that black's pawns look quite impressive. But there's a chance to open things up with b3. I have a feeling that if white is going to get somewhere in this position, this might be the way to do it. But it is very unbalanced. So Caruana played rook c1. Carlsen exchanged and moved the queen out to f5. So that protects the h-pawn, so enabling black to castle. And this is, again, another position where you think that maybe Caruana, if he'd had more time, would have perhaps gone a different way and simply castled. And both sides castle, and well, it's an interesting position. When I mentioned earlier it's not clear who benefits from the advance of these h-pawns, I can understand why Caruana didn't want to castle kingside, because, you know, there's a potential sacrifice hanging over white's head here. And black's queen looks kind of nice looking at these light squares. And you never know, e4 could come and knight e5. I mean, maybe white should sort of lock this down with f3. But then again, once the queen moves, there's always the chance to open things up with f5, f4. Now, we haven't talked about white's chances on the queen side. This is definitely safer than the game continuation. And c5 really opens up the position. But, of course, with the king still in the middle, then that is a really fraught situation. Carlsen castled. His king is safe, while white's king is still in the middle and the position is beginning to open. Now, so far so good for white. In fact, white is objectively still absolutely fine here. But I think this is the kind of practical judgment that is so easy to get wrong in a rapid play game. Caruana went in for this, and I think it's just a big mistake, because holding white's position together here is just really difficult. So this pawn is a little bit loose. You can see it sort of come away from the rest of its army. White's king is still in the middle, and the rooks obviously aren't connected. But white does have some trumps. Control of this square is, of course, very important. But Carlsen's judgment was absolutely correct here, that in fact black objectively is absolutely fine. Maybe not better with best play, but black is doing fine. It's just very tricky, you know, this bishop bouncing around to attack the king, the queen waiting in the wings, as is the knight, and yeah, this pawn is a bit vulnerable. Best move here is actually knight e4, which isn't a very natural move, because one's natural instinct is to play the knight into d5, blockading. But knight e4 is tricky, and after bishop a5 check, king e2. So white is dancing on a high wire here, but actually is okay. And after this move, I know this looks really bizarre, moving away from this pawn, but if it advances, then it'll be okay. Or indeed, well, there are threats down here first. It's just really double-edged. But knight d5 played, the natural move. But e4 is very dangerous for white, because the knight is coming in with tempo attacking the queen. In fact, knight e5 should be prevented. And actually, black is still not better here. It's possible to get rid of this knight, but actually the knight sits quite well on e3, and this is just a really double-edged position. That knight is actually beautiful there, controlling some really important squares. So coming back here, c7 played by Caruana, and this was just a terrible misjudgment. I mean, it's impossible to say what he overlooked. Maybe he doesn't even know himself. But after this piece sacrifice, the knight comes into e5, attacking the queen, and the queen is running really short of squares. And there are so many tricks here. Well, you know, it's simple stuff like queen d4, this knight f3 check. There's also knight d3 to check and to take the rook. Queen d5 is a tricky move, because the queen is actually defended by the knight, but rook b8 is really strong. And after castles, we have a simple trick, rook takes knight. So if rook takes knight f3 check, and taking the queen, and if queen takes d6, well, this doesn't win immediately for black. In fact, white can hang on for a bit, but this is such an unpleasant position. White's king is really vulnerable here, and black's king is completely safe. But in the game, Fabiano played knight d5. So white is lost anyway, but this actually loses immediately. So the trick is knight takes and then knight e7 check, but Carlsen played king h7, completely safe king. And if knight e7, then we move the queen attacking this one. Also looking down here as well. And this is just hopelessly lost. An absolute shocker. Well, let's just try one last thing. If queen f1, then we can play knight d3 check. And we can take, well, we can take this with knight or rook. They're both, well, it's absolutely devastating. So a crunch there from Carlsen in game 2. And it wasn't just the tactical oversights in those final moments. I think this was just a misjudgment from Caruana coming way back here when he played c5. It's simply not a practical move. And it showed that he just doesn't have that feel for rapid play that Carlsen does. So, thanks for watching. If you're not a subscriber, then click down the button there, free to subscribe. You get instant notifications if you click on the bell when we produce a new video. If you want to support us, look up there on PayPal and Patreon. And if you want to check out the merch, then do check out the merch there below, the official PowerPlayChess merchandise. Thanks very much.